Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning. I think it's a pretty exciting time for applied science, technology, and innovation. The tremendous amount of technology innovations that we're seeing everywhere, and in fact, you can make lists until the cows come home. The reason why we're particularly excited about this particular time is that perhaps for the first time, many of the applications of these technologies are going to affect more of us and most of us on the planet than at any other time in history before. So what are the actual technologies that are going to make a difference? Well, you can look at this tremendous number of lists that everybody can create, and many of them are pretty exciting lists that have a tremendous number of technologies. But one of the things that at least my colleagues and I set out to do, together with the help of some technologists and economist friends, is to at least try and sort through many of these lists and many of these technologies. And we actually had a few particular criteria in mind. First, we were trying to understand the technologies where there's been rapid advancement in terms of the technology, in terms of its cost and performance, as well as in terms of the breakthrough technologies themselves in a way that affects economics. So that was one criteria. The second criteria was to think about the technologies that are going to touch the most number of people, companies, and economies. So in other words, we're looking at the question of the scope of the impact of the technologies. And then the third consideration we had was to think about the technologies that were going to touch big parts of the economy, either big chunks of GDP or big profit pools for companies, but rather, in other words, technologies that are going to have an economic consequence. And that's how we came up with the dozen technology categories we're going to talk about here. So let me go through what those are. The first group of technologies, categories, are ones that I would call have to do with IT and how we use it. And so you would see the mobile internet and all the various applications that come with mobility and the internet. You also have cloud computing. Cloud computing is particularly important because if you think about it, the spend that we have on IT roughly is about $3 trillion globally that we spend on technologies, products, and services that could be affected by cloud computing. Then we've got the Internet of Things, which has been talked about a lot. But what's interesting, again, are the economic consequences and the scale of what the Internet of Things would do. Then we have automation of knowledge work, perhaps not as talked about as much. But if you think about the number of knowledge workers in the world, somewhere between 230 million and about 300 million knowledge workers in the world, and we pay them about between $9 and $12 trillion annually. As you think about technology affecting how knowledge work gets done, that's a pretty large canvas of impact. The next group is what you might call machines working for us. So in other words, if you think about what advanced robotics is starting to do, both from the very, very, very high end of that, but also even what technologies like Baxter and what Rodney Brooks and others have been working on can do, which start to change how we interact with the robots, that's going to have a profound impact. Then we have the impact of autonomous and near-autonomous vehicles. And here we're not just talking about the Google driverless car, but think about what's happening with trucks, think of what's happening with submersibles, with commercial drones, as well as other forms of autonomous and near-autonomous vehicles. Then we've got 3D printing. So this is the category of technology that have to do with how we work with machines and how machines work for us. The next group of technologies are where we think that finally how we think about energy has finally come of age. And this is a combination of think about what's happening with energy storage, as well as what's starting to happen with how we think about extraction for some of the advanced oil and gas exploration and recovery, so think shale gas. And then lastly, think about what's starting to happen at scale now with renewable energy. So that's the next third group of technologies that we think are going to have a significant impact per the criteria I described. And then lastly, we're starting to change the building blocks of just about everything. A big part of that is what's happening with genomics. And another big part of that is what's actually happening with advanced materials, whether we talk about graphene or nanomaterials or the many things that are starting to happen in material science. So we think at least this group of 12 technologies in these 4 categories, at least by the criteria that we set out, which is the rate at which the breakthroughs are occurring, second, the reach and scope of what these things will touch in terms of people, companies, and sectors, and then lastly, the economics at stake. We even attempted to size the impact of some of these technology categories. And keep in mind that what we sized here basically are the applications that we could conceive of and that we're starting to see evidence of. As we know, science will always surprise us, and there'll be many, many, many more applications in these categories. But you can already start to see that these are going to have, these are very large technologies. We think the question, though, that's interesting for companies in particular, and many of us, is, so who's going to capture the value of this? We think a big part of the numbers that we just showed here are going to go to consumer surplus. We already know that in the case of the internet, the last 20 years of the internet, while the impact of the internet has been profound, close to 2/3 of the value of the internet has gone to consumer surplus, all the things that we as consumers love. We also know that there are going to be massive surplus shifts between sectors and between companies as they compete to capture value. And then, of course, there'll be net new revenues and growth that will come from the creation of new products and services. But this is going to be the part that's going to be competed for. And the answer here and even the ranking of these technologies vary depending on which ones you're looking at. Some of these already have business models that allow companies to capture value. Some of these don't yet have business models, and those business models will need to be invented. We also spent a fair amount of time thinking about the impact on individuals and businesses and economics. As opposed to take you through this complicated chart, let me just summarize the highlights. What does this all mean? First, one of the things that's fascinating is that you see that there's IT and big data and analytics almost in every one of these technology and applications, which is one of the themes for this conference, and we can talk about that some more. We also find that combinations of technologies actually multiply the impact. So think about what's happening in genomics. When genomics meets big data, the impact of that combination is pretty powerful. We also find that the benefits will not be evenly distributed, whether you think about this in terms of individuals, companies, and economies, or even geographies. So that would be an important thing to keep in mind. The good news, though, is we think that consumers are going to be big winners in all of this, because for the most part, most of the benefits from this will result in new products, new services for us as consumers, but also, quite frankly, the economics will tend to favor consumers per the consumer surplus arguments. This will also be a great time for entrepreneurs, just because a lot of what these technologies make possible is the creation of new products, new companies, and new services. But perhaps most importantly, from an economic standpoint, many of these technologies change the minimum efficient scale of what it takes to participate in these activities. So think about the application of 3D printing and what an individual can actually do. So this is a great time for entrepreneurs. We think, though, there'll be an interesting shift in how we think about work, because as you see, roughly half of these technologies are going to have a profound impact in terms of how we think about work, what work is, where it gets done, how it gets done, how we complement what robots do, and what we as individuals and human beings do. So there's going to be an interesting impact in terms of how we think about work. The interesting question for companies in particular, in addition to all the innovation that they're going to pursue, is the question of business models. As I pointed out, most of these technologies don't yet have business models, and absent innovation on business models, much of the surplus here may actually end up as consumer surplus, as we've seen with the internet in the last 2 decades. So the big imperative for companies is how to think about innovating business models. And it's also going to present some challenges for many of the incumbents, because most of the economics of these technologies don't actually work to the benefit of incumbents. And then lastly, the policies and rules in terms of how these things are managed are going to have a hard time keeping up, but they have to, as we think about data privacy, as we think about the impacts of new ethical questions raised by genomics, and so forth. I'll wrap up at that point. I think we're going to have an interesting panel discussion with my friend Eric Schmidt.
So Eric, you have a new book out, I hear. The New Digital Age, Reshaping the Future of People, Nations and Business. That's an ambitious arc, and it's a fascinating read. And in the book, there's a section where you say basically the ability to gather data more effectively is going to be a game changer. And James has just run through a whole series of sort of new technologies that are coming along. But I wonder, where do you see data having the biggest impact? Is it education? Is it healthcare? I mean, from your perspective.
Well, I simply agree with James.
Oh dear.
First, let me say thank you for inviting me. I've been a reader and subscriber to The Economist for something like 30 years. So everything I know, I actually learn from The Economist.
That's about how long I've worked there.
There's a problem of recursion in this conference, right?
I've worked there 30 years. I think, maybe there's some connection we have.
First place, I agree with the framing that James has given, which is, as always, these guys are right. And to me, the question, it's too early to know exactly where all the stuff is going to be. But I agree with the statement that there are huge business and disruptive technologies coming in the 12 that he identified. It's very hard to know exactly how, which components it will be. If you think about 5 years ago, almost no one predicted the fracking revolution, and yet there were a small number of people who talked about it, but it was not in the mainstream. It took a while. Now, essentially every computer company is into big data, and they simply reframe whatever they're doing to be big data. So again, the real value is created by innovators who come up with new algorithms that do things that are surprisingly useful.
So big data sort of encompasses, it can be redefined in many different ways. And James, your take on that? If I said one of those areas where data is really going to be primordial of most importance, which one would it be of your technologies?
Well, I think certainly the technologies that have to do with, I talked about mobile technology, and we talked about, I think, an area where we don't often talk enough about big data, which is genomics. I think when genomics meets digital technology, there's going to be a lot of data applications that have to do with that. And then the other place I would also go is that from an economic standpoint, we have a few sectors in the economy that for the most part have been big drags on growth and productivity. And by the way, these happen to be sectors where data has a big application. So I think healthcare, think education, and think of the public sector, for example. Those have been...
In other words, the inefficient parts of our government?
They are the most inefficient parts of our government and also economies. I mean, if you look at productivity, first of all, those sectors are very large chunks of the economy. And if you look at the productivity map, they're also the productivity drags on the economy.
Right.
So the problem with your argument, so I've been asked, we've been on the book tour for 2 months, so we get asked lots of interesting questions, and the questions that I always get asked is, if Dustin Hoffman's answer was plastics,
what's the new one?
And why I get asked this question is beyond me. It's like, who actually remembers this movie? But the correct answer, of course, is healthcare. Because essentially all of the jobs under current assumptions in America that will be created will be healthcare, because healthcare is relatively inefficient with respect to labor improvements for obvious reasons, and it's a huge growth industry. Unless something's done with cost containment, healthcare will actually exceed the entire revenue of the United States, in 30 years. So something's got to give.
Well, you served on a presidential commission looking at data as well, and you were looking at healthcare in particular. How do you think we could apply data to healthcare? Is there any low-hanging fruit that you would point to?
Well, one of the core problems that I've discovered in these government systems is that our waste is someone else's revenue.
Yeah.
And so in a political system, the first question you want to ask is, do people actually want to fix it? And are they willing to make the necessary criticisms and tough calls, whether that's with respect to unionization or practices or the way the markets work? In America, healthcare is roughly twice that of percentage of cost for roughly similar outcomes to the Western world. And Western Europe is quite sophisticated in its healthcare approach. So with respect to data, there are two obvious areas. The first is healthcare record interoperability. The Bush administration worked very hard to establish interoperability standards for data healthcare. If you are a member of one of these very large clinics like Cleveland Clinic, or there's a couple that are here, they have large databases about you with incompatible data formats. Those are now interchangeable. That's a serious improvement. The bigger impact will be in medical monitoring through your mobile phone, transdermal patches, pills that you'll ingest that will Wi-Fi out the condition of your stomach. And you think I'm joking, there is such a one approved by the FDA already. And so there's probably going to be a very large business in mobile apps that are tied to your mobile phone that are healthcare related. And that has a significant opportunity to change the sort of where the costs are. The core costs in healthcare are still largely related to overbilling, overtreatment, and last 6 months of life. And those are essentially political problems at this point.
Well, and also you add to that the fact that we happen to have a unique health system that tends to reward doctors and caregivers for activity, as opposed to for outcomes.
I'm struck by this pill, so instead of Intel inside, we'll have Google inside or something else.
To be clear, Google does not make this pill.
Understood, but you make the phones, which is, or at least the software on the phones, which is wonderful. Okay, in your book, Eric, you cite the example of Amazon using reams of data about its merchants to sort of assess their creditworthiness. And in fact, you say that they now make loans where banks actually might not even touch a customer because they just have so many insights. I mean, how many more opportunities are there for companies like an Amazon, your own?
Well, James and I had this conversation a while ago, and it was pretty clear that every business can use this kind of an approach to target the way their sales force works, the way their credit works, the way their products work. So I'm busy trying to sell books. Now, a reasonable data approach, and of course the book industry has no concept of doing this apparently, is to try to figure out if you have this category of book, is it more likely to be sold in the Midwest or the East Coast or what have you? Because the cost in the book industry is a lot related to returns, right? And you want to minimize returns.
Yeah.
So in an idealized model, you would get exactly the number of books to exactly the correct number of bookstores, and it would be per author, per category, based on the weather, if it's snowing, do people buy less of fiction and more nonfiction, and those kinds of things. I'm using that as a very simple, easy to understand. So if you apply that model, it's true for every business.
So in terms of how would we use data exhaust in that sort of way? James, do you have any view on this, or Eric? How can we track what's been happening in the past that is just a byproduct of the activity that we've always done, that we've never used the data before, and now we actually can use the data as a signal to learn something?
Well, I mean, you write about it quite effectively in your current Economist issue, which is if you look at what Vernon has done with recapture, right? So this is the economic view of this is multi-sided economic models, right? Where you take advantage of the fact that users doing one thing in one arena create incredibly valuable information that can be monetized or leveraged in another arena. Think of what you do with search, which is then applied to advertising. Think of what he did with recapture, which is now used to translate books. So the question then becomes, how do you...
By the way, who would have thought?
Right, so the question then is, as users do what they do, and as we capture, whether it's exhaust data or any of these behaviors, what is that information, and what large profit pools can this apply to for business models?
One of the things that you did not talk in your presentation that I've sort of come to believe is that when you look at these things analytically, you say you need this kind of software, you need this kind of software, you need to solve this kind of solution. But that's not, in fact, how the industry emerges, the new one. The new one emerges as a set of platforms, and the platforms are where the aggregated value occurs. So I would phrase this question differently, and I would say, given that there's all this data being generated, much of which is being ignored, which is quite useful, could you imagine a platform that would somehow aggregate that data and start using it for interesting things and become monetizable? And the sort of the way the industry really creates wealth is by creating platforms. Because platforms then get extensible, people work with you, you have common APIs and so forth. James did not talk about this, but the more likely scenario organizationally is a set of platform providers of big data that are quite interesting. Right?
Okay. So let me ask, in the 90s, the battle was over the platform of the computing device. Microsoft was a platform.
No, Microsoft was the battle in the 90s.
Oh, well, I'm thinking of also, for example, who would go into the living room, and would it be the cable box?
The answer was Microsoft.
Yeah, without a doubt. So we're now in the 21st century. It's no
the answer is not Microsoft.
Clearly, that's right. You can see where I'm headed. These platforms are very interesting. Who is going to be the data platform of our lives?
I don't think we know. The trend in computer science is very much away from the sort of monopoly PC platform that most of you all, younger people than me, grew up with. and it sort of reached its peak in the mid-90s. And if you look what happened, is that the advent of the internet opened up new platforms which are now exploding in form, fit, and finish. In Android's case, Android has more than 900 million users that are activated, and probably significantly more than that. And it's essentially an open source platform. You can do anything you want to. So we estimate somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of Android uses are ones we don't know about, nobody talked to us about, they're not under any kind of license, and of course they're all permitted. So it's hard to know how those platforms will look like, but what you see is this notion that since everything digital has an operating system and everything digital has to talk to each other, that becomes sort of a self-configurable platform. The back-end data services have not caught up to that, and the back-end data services will get standardized in some interesting new ways, probably by some new companies that have not yet been founded.
I would also add, perhaps to push and challenge Eric a little bit, I think there's one way in which we can think about technology platforms, and perhaps in the way that Eric described. But I would also think in this case about what I'll call data and behavioral platforms. So where people, individuals, are doing what they do. So think about what you do when you're on Amazon, for example. You are reviewing books, you're viewing books. So in other words, there's a behavioral set of behaviors you're doing on that platform that is creating its own exhaust data, to use your word. So the question then becomes, what does that experience platform allow you to do?
Right.
I think we're starting to see.
And the core issue there is privacy rights, regulation of use of that data, and so forth and so on.
But it's also about scalability. And so your point about companies that we have not yet seen being perhaps the data platform for the mainstream public sounds to me strange when you consider that this looks like an infrastructure, it looks like a utility, and it's going to need scale, and it's going to need capital. Only a few companies could actually step up to the plate for that.
If you walked in with a billion-person plan for a brand new data service, that people believed you could raise the money just like that.
I just wanted to pick up on you mentioned privacy, and clearly there's a tension between exploiting data and protecting data, and drawing the line is difficult. How do you see this debate evolving? And clearly there are different opinions between, say, the European Union and places within the European Union, the US.
You see different approaches. A brand new company that nobody knows is perfectly happy to take your address book and spam everybody to death. And then once they become a certain size, they apologize and they stop doing that. Now,
they should find another way to do it.
Did they understand they were going to apologize, or did they really not think about it because they were too young and they thought it was fine, or it was just so competitive they had a choice? So over and over again, you look in the fight for users, the small companies are willing to essentially push the edge, if you will, of what's appropriate. Larger companies are subject to both, good judgment, I think, pressure from their users, and government policy. It's well understood that Europe is at the leading edge of this, and there are a series of data privacy initiatives in Europe. And my guess is that Europe will eventually put more and more restrictions on this sort of use. We were just in Europe for 2 weeks on the book tour, and this question comes up in every context. People are concerned about, how is this going to be used? Have you fully disclosed it to us? That kind of thing.
What do you?
I was going to add one other point, which I think, not to minimize the privacy question, which is obviously a big question. I think it's going to go through the kind of dynamics that Eric described. But I think there's another, perhaps larger question, which is, in many of the applications of big data, most of those applications don't really depend on specific named identified data to do with you. It's more the patterns of data. So there, the questions are so much a question of privacy, but a question of, as I contribute my behavior to what becomes a pattern, is there any economic value that comes back to me, or is that captured in some other different way?
So let me turn that the other way, the way a privacy person would say, okay, why should I trust that the data that you're being used will be properly secure, properly anonymized? A failure to anonymize, insufficient
because this morning there was talk about using data specifically to personalize and target individuals, and it's getting easier and easier, and there's more and more data. So I think it is going to be, I think, a real flashpoint, is already, and will be more so.
Yeah, I was going to ask just one question, and then we should throw it open to the floor. So what would you like in terms of regulation? What ideally would you want? And let's focus into privacy. What is the sort of golden rule that you could sign up for that we're not doing today?
Well, the general rule with privacy, first place, my own view about privacy is that you have to fight for it or you're going to lose it. And you're going to lose it because when privacy and, for example, security and threat compete, the government will violate your privacy, especially in countries that don't have as strong a privacy protections as the United States does. And you can see how strong ours are compared to what you might want. So with respect to how I would do this, regulators are likely to want to do this. And the problem is that they regulate the mechanism, not the outcome.
Sure.
By regulating the mechanism, they enforce an architectural structure which then prohibits future innovation. A classic example is with respect to copyright and YouTube. We now have an extraordinarily sophisticated content matching system which largely addresses the issue of illegally uploaded copyrighted information into YouTube, and it works extremely well. We have a similar thing to music. It took us 5 years to develop this. It's a very significant tour de force from computer science. I always worry that the regulators will somehow prevent us from actually solving the problem a year from now. So the message is, if you're going to regulate the outcome and let the industry innovate to a solution that solves that problem.
And I just wanted to ask one quick question, then we will open to the floor. But you talked about platforms earlier on, and in your book you say that clearly a lot of the data that's being generated now through all of these new platforms, it's sort of like a gift to authoritarian regimes. Yes. But at the same time, it's empowering bottom-up movements, grassroots movements. There's obviously a fundamental tension here. You're very optimistic about the outcome. There are several people who aren't. I mean, why so optimistic?
This is a question of belief. You know, it's very hard to know how this will play out. But ultimately, you come to the view that the vast, vast majority of people are well-meaning, honest, caring. This is true whether they make $1 a day or the incomes in the United States. And so we're dealing with the issues of a small number of people. And over again, what we see is a larger number of people will sort of see what they're doing and will address it. It's very difficult for a bad person, an evil person, to completely escape the digital trail that they leave, especially if they're under stress and they're young. And often people of this kind, they're under stress and they're young. They make mistakes. In the Boston bombing, the two guys who did the evil act carjack this guy, keep him in the car for 90 minutes. He eventually gets out of the car and he leaves his cell phone in the car. Using that information, they were apprehended down the street. One man was killed, the other one was shot, ended up in the boat in the town, and now in jail. So, you know, in the manual for evil behavior, don't let cell phones be near you, you know, is like the 27th of 100 rules of things you have to worry about. My favorite is John McAfee, who was on the lam out of Belize, in Guatemala, and was posting where he was, or things about him, shows a picture of himself. It has metadata of his geolocation. Within 1 second, it's discovered. He was obviously not aware that he was posting his precise physical location. When you're on the lam, please don't do that.
I think you said he was on holiday, extended, just in case.
I think most people would say that posting your location as you move from place, trying to avoid the Belizean authorities is sort of on the lam, but you can call it, you're the editor, you can do whatever you want.
Just in case. Just
but the fact of the matter is, whatever you're doing, be aware that all your locations are being posted on your Twitter and other activities.
Great. Let's open to the floor for questions. Can we get the lights up a bit, and so we can see where our microphone runners are? Questions for our panelists, please. Anybody?
I see one right here.
One here? Oh, yeah. Just round the front. Can we get a microphone down the front here? Yeah, lovely.
I'm trying to use the parlance in Ken's book about N equals all, so that is a framing to my question. We had an interesting debate in our family about this new Supreme Court decision about taking DNA from suspects, potentially from suspects of violent crimes. And we got to talking about where before N, when N is relatively small, I think it's pretty manageable. And when N is everybody, it's also manageable. But in that transition, we were talking about over the next few years, who's going to have their DNA, what subgroups of people, and it's probably the military and now people who are suspected of violent crimes. So I wondered about in this transition, before we get from n equals some to n equals all and in that S-curve, do we worry about drawing the wrong conclusions because the sample set is somehow biased or not fully represented? And is that something that concerns you? I think that it used to be that way with cell phones, that not everybody had one, and now everybody does, so you don't kind of worry that it's only rich people, quote unquote, or the rich world. But there are some things that I worry would draw the wrong conclusions because the sample set is not right.
I'm not a person who believes that DNA predicts your social behavior. And so my concern about what's going on here is that we're in a situation where it costs, $10,000 to do a DNA sequence, $100,000, and it'll be $100 within, it's following the Moore's Law curve. And so what are the protections about this information? Who has access to it? Did I opt in for its use by somebody else? These are all the questions that I would worry about. So in the case of DNA sequencing, where is it stored? Is it properly protected? Who has rights to it? An obvious solution is to say that you own the data. Well, if you're a criminal, right, and it's just been sequenced, do you still own the data? Or does your lawyer, or does the judge? And these are issues that we have to face. Europe has solved this problem largely by having rules about biometric databases, which obviously includes DNA and face recognition and other things. And the general rule is that corporations can't have them unless they have full opt-in for each and every sample. And my guess is in the United States, we'll end up with some hybrid like that.
Yeah. Question at the back.
Yes, thank you. I was recently reading, Eric, that you're involved with the consulting team that worked on the Obama campaign. Some very interesting work was done there, and that team is now rolling out and is going to be applying its processes to various businesses in healthcare and public policy. I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the kinds of applicability you see coming for their work.
This particular group was a spin out of the Obama campaign. I worked on the Obama campaign in Chicago in my 20% time and had a good time. And what they do is they do statistical techniques that essentially score people in the aggregate and sort of predict behavior. So if you want to know a question, will you win, will you lose, this is the team to talk to. And in a political sense, that makes sense. It turns out that a lot of non-political actors have the same problems. How will people react to this idea? How will people behave? And again, these tools are not specific to individuals. They're essentially data analytics using 30 or 40 compound sources, which are then merged together. And it's a startup that's trying to do that.
There's a question over there.
Yeah, hi. You talked a lot about privacy, and with a lot of people, 5 billion people coming online soon, there's a lot of people going to exist online. But what are your thoughts on the right not to exist or the right to be forgotten?
When you say the right to be forgotten, what I've learned is to ask, what do you mean? And take me through a scenario of what that means for you.
So let's say somebody has a criminal record and they have done their service to the community, or they have done their term in jail, and now they left, and now they're seeking opportunities for employment or academic opportunities, etc. And with the open platform or digital platform, or this open access to information, how are people going to actually avoid being kind of like treated for that specific thing that they did?
The scenario that you're referring to is one I'm very concerned about. The nature of the internet is that there's no delete button, and that the more you try to delete something, the harder it is to delete it, because people will keep copies of it and so forth. So the scenario in the United States is that you have a running with juvenile court, you're a good adult, you can get that expunged from your record, you apply to a corporation, the corporation does a Google search, there it is, and you said you were never convicted of anything, you're a liar, and out you go, right? So that really does affect people. I don't know how to solve this problem, because any answer that I would give you that sounds like a solution would also be extended then to censor or filter the internet, which is obviously not a good thing.
And it's in the book you talk about data permanence and the idea that we are the first generation where everything remains and you can't take it away. And you said we may need to think about sealing juvenile records. So basically people wouldn't be able to search for anything for somebody who's under the age of 18. When I think about what my children put on the internet, I'd really like that to happen.
Well, I proposed as a joke some years ago that people would, by policy or by custom, change their name at 18. They said, oh, that wasn't me. I didn't really do that. That was not me drunk. It sort of looked like me. The problem with that is that the face recognition software is so good that you can't evade it by changing your name. That's why this biometrics thing is so important.
Well, in addition to biometrics, what about wearable computing? It seems like not only are we going to be collecting data about ourselves, but we can collect data about our environment and other people. Right. So just as the camera led to, if you will, a sense of privacy violation on the common street where people could walk and now everything was instantiated in a fixed media, film. So to wearable computing where we're collecting data about other people, how do we jive that new world with your principles on privacy?
Well, again, societies will face how to solve this. Paparazzi rules differ by country. And it's certainly possible with wearable computing that you'll have a lot more paparazzis. And my own view is that with Google Glass, which is an obvious example of this question, we've made a decision to not generally release it until we're satisfied that there's sufficient privacy, protections of one kind or another. But I also think that with respect to wearable computing, new social conventions will emerge. Like, this is a place where it's okay to do this, and this is a place where it's not okay to do this. And you can imagine where those places might be.
So the glass bar we'll have where it's okay to wear them, and then the non-glass bar. Other questions? One in the front here. Oh, there's one right to the right as well. If we get one microphone over to the gentleman on the right, and we'll take this question here. Hopefully we have time for that one over there.
For Eric, for the competence of organizations, you have to measure your performances. How is Google using data, and what sort of data is using to measure its competitive edge? And I think it's one of the obviously very innovative firm, so I would appreciate it.
We track our hiring very carefully. So we track both the scoring of people, and then we do follow-up based on the way they're rated, and we basically cross-correlate back to the hiring forms. It's interesting that by doing so, we discovered this is a very liberal, very open company. Lots of female-male differences. Men did not do a very good job of predicting the performance of female employees and vice versa. There are all sorts of hidden biases that show up when you do this sort of longitudinal outcomes testing, and I would encourage that to see what sort of problems you have. We've addressed those by various mechanisms. That's probably the most important of the ones we've done.
Question?
Yes, thank you for your time again. With the massive decentralization and expansion of where our data resides and the infrastructure that connects it, do you sense that there are any challenges or vulnerabilities truly to this global, nondescript, non-quantifiable network of infrastructure that connects the ability to utilize and operate on this data, or do you feel that the systems have become so robust that they are now able to self-sustain? For example, I think some of the work you're doing in some of the communities with fiber to the home in a small way is providing that in a community, but globally as we cross national borders and we have nation states involved in infrastructure, do you see threats to that, or is that something we have to resolve as well, or have we reached sustainability?
I think at an architectural level, the internet is highly robust, and the data centers and data services that we're talking about are now highly replicated and very, very, very reliable. I think the technology has gotten to that point, and I'm very impressed with what everybody's doing in the industry. The issue of cyber attack remains troublesome, and it's very hard to quantify, when the next Chinese attack occurs, could it go beyond just poking around and break something that was significant? I don't think we really know.
Let's see if there's one more question.
Oh, there is over here.
Yeah, great.
Hi. In today's world, when you look at digital, it's really the people with the highest reach and frequency are going to have the best data. Kind of sets you apart, Google, Facebook, Apple. And if you look at, you're going to have small gaps to fill where everybody else is going to have really, really small, valuable data with big gaps to fill. And if you really want big data to boost the economy, doesn't there need to be a marketplace for this data to be shared across companies? And in this marketplace, is there a need for somebody to be the middleman or the neutral third party? And in full disclosure, I work for Nielsen.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I think the experience of creating intermediaries of this form has been a difficult one historically. I mean, there have been many attempts to create intermediary platforms. The difficulty is that unless your platform is tied to the behavioral experience that users are having, it's actually very difficult. So I would throw the question back to you to say, if you're planning to be an intermediary, at least have a big enough platform where users are actually spending time on it so that you're creating the data that allows people to come back to it. I think it's very difficult to just be an intermediary.
Good.
Would you agree, Eric?
I agree with that.
Agrees with everything. Eric, thank you very much. James,
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you all.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks.